December 1942, 0502 hours. The North Atlantic wind cuts through the night like a blade. Waves crash against the cold steel hull of a half-finished aircraft carrier at the Newport News shipyard, Virginia. Sparks fall like orange snow as thousands of welders work under blinding floodlights, their silhouettes flickering against towering cranes and steaming decks. Every clang of steel echoes like a heartbeat in the dark. Across the ocean, in a smoke-filled bunker outside Berlin, a group of German naval officers hunch over a chart. Red pins mark American ships reported sunk. A U-boat captain boasts that another Yankee carrier won't see the sunrise. The men laugh, confident that America's shipyards can't keep up with their torpedoes. But even as the words leave his mouth, across the Atlantic, another ship is sliding into the water. The USS Essex, born from 1,000 hands and 100 sleepless nights, hits the tide, the first of a new breed of giants that will soon blot out the horizon. By dawn, while German U-boats search for their next kill, America is already building the next carrier to replace it. The age of industrial warfare has begun. When the sun rose over the shattered remnants of Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941, the world witnessed not only the destruction of a fleet, but the exposure of an empire unprepared for the new kind of war that was coming. The Pacific Ocean, once guarded by American might, now belonged to the Empire of Japan. 6 Japanese carriers had unleashed their fury in a coordinated strike that left battleships burning and aircraft twisted into melted wreckage. Across the Atlantic, Germany's Kriegsmarine watched with satisfaction. For Adolf Hitler's high command, America's humiliation was proof of its industrial weakness. German naval intelligence, already confident after years of U-boat dominance, assessed that the United States, a nation still mobilizing from peace, would require at least 5 years to restore its Pacific fleet. But the Germans misunderstood something fundamental. The American way of war was not forged in battlefield glory, it was built in the factories. By early 1942, the U.S. Navy faced its greatest crisis. Of the carriers that survived Pearl Harbor, only a handful were seaworthy. The Lexington and Yorktown were racing to plug holes in the Pacific defense line. The Enterprise, the only undamaged fleet carrier, became a wandering symbol of defiance, its deck patched, its crew exhausted, its presence stretched from the Coral Sea to Midway. In Washington, panic brewed quietly beneath a mask of confidence. Naval planners understood that carriers, not battleships, were now the backbone of warfare. But with Japan launching wave after wave of raids across the Pacific, time was a weapon America didn't yet possess. Germany, meanwhile, believed that its own technological edge, the U-boat wolf packs, would choke America's Atlantic supply routes before any large-scale shipbuilding effort could materialize. German Admiral Karl Donitz claimed that the sea itself will strangle the Americans before their factories can breathe. By the spring of 1942, his submarines were sinking Allied tonnage faster than the Allies could replace it, over 600,000 tons per month at the peak. American newspapers printed grim headlines of ships lost at sea. Oil tankers burned just off the East Coast. Civilians in New York and Florida watched black smoke on the horizon while Navy convoys struggled to form. In Berlin, German intelligence officers celebrated what they called the Second Blockade of America. Yet beneath the despair, something remarkable was already happening. Across the continental United States, an industrial awakening was underway, one that would reshape the very definition of war. Factories that once built cars, washing machines, and farm equipment began retooling for combat. The auto plants of Detroit, led by men like Henry Ford and William Cunson, were ordered to convert assembly lines into aircraft engine and ship component production. In California, the Mare Island and Hunters Point shipyards began expanding at unprecedented speed, swallowing entire neighborhoods to make room for dry docks large enough to berth carriers. In Virginia, the Newport News Shipbuilding Company, which had been building commercial liners and cruisers, received new blueprints for something different: the Essex-class aircraft carrier. Larger, faster, and far more resilient than its predecessors, it was designed with one radical idea. It could be built not one at a time, but in parallel across multiple shipyards. And behind this effort was a force that no nation, not Germany, not Japan, had ever truly faced before: the American industrial workforce. Men too old for combat stood beside young women in overalls and bandanas, riveting hull plates under roaring generators. Farmers left their fields to weld deck frames. Engineers who had never seen the ocean were now designing floating airfields capable of carrying 100 aircraft. This was not just rearmament, it was transformation. As 1942 progressed, reports began to reach Berlin that defied logic. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships in a matter of weeks. The Bethlehem steel yards on the East Coast were launching new destroyers at record pace. But to the Germans, these were seen as anomalies, not trends. Their analysts concluded that the United States, a nation still mobilizing from peace, would build small vessels quickly, but carriers, complex, massive, and intricate, would take years. They were wrong, because in hidden shipyards from Pascagoula to San Francisco, the blueprints of the Essex-class were already multiplying, one set for each dock, one vision shared by thousands. And soon sound of German torpedoes in the Atlantic would be drowned out by something far louder, the thunder of American shipyards forging a fleet the world had never seen. By early 1943, the war had entered a phase that few in Berlin or Tokyo had anticipated. America's early losses, once considered fatal, were beginning to look more like the first tremors of a vast machine waking from sleep. The U.S. Maritime Commission had become the beating heart of this machine. Created before the war to modernize the merchant fleet, it was now repurposed for a singular mission: to transform the United States into the greatest shipbuilding power in human history. Under the leadership of Admiral Emory S. Land and driven by the unrelenting energy of industrialists like Henry J. Kaiser, it became the engine that turned blueprints into metal giants. Kaiser's shipyards were unlike anything the world had seen. Located in Richmond, California, his yards operated around the clock, powered by 24-hour shifts of laborers who came from every corner of America. Farmers from the Midwest, miners from Colorado, mechanics from Detroit, women from small towns who had never seen the sea. Posters called them the men and women behind the fleet, but in truth, they were the army behind victory. They built ships faster than engineers could believe. A Liberty ship, once thought to require 8 months, was now being launched in less than 30 days. One was famously completed in 4 days and 15 hours, a world record. But while these feats made headlines, the deeper miracle was taking place in the Navy's carrier program. The Essex-class aircraft carrier had been designed in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, as a modern replacement for the Yorktown class. But after the attack, the Navy ordered not 2 or 3, but 24. This was not a fleet. It was a declaration of intent. Each carrier stretched 872 feet from bow to stern, with enough deck space to launch and recover squadrons of Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers. But what made them truly revolutionary wasn't just their firepower, it was how they were built. America no longer built ships sequentially. It built them modularly, in sections. Each piece of the hull, each engine compartment, each island tower was constructed in separate facilities, often hundreds of miles apart. These massive components were then transported to coastal shipyards, welded together like puzzle pieces, and launched within months. It was breathtaking. Between 1943 and 1945, American shipyards launched 17 Essex-class carriers, each one representing over 30,000 tons of steel, thousands of miles of wiring, and the combined labor of over 1 million Americans. Germany's naval intelligence units struggled to comprehend the numbers. Reports arriving in Berlin were dismissed as exaggerations. The Kriegsmarine's Foreign Intelligence Branch noted that the Americans claimed to be launching carriers at intervals too short to be credible. German analysts accustomed to the precision and complexity of European shipbuilding could not grasp how an aircraft carrier could be produced faster than their own Type 9 U-boats. Meanwhile, in Japan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had begun to recognize the danger. He warned, "We can win many battles, but we cannot win against factories." His prediction was becoming reality. The industrial base that Japan and Germany had underestimated was transforming into the most formidable force on Earth. In places like Brooklyn Navy Yard, Puget Sound, and Newport News, the atmosphere was electric. The sound of hammers and riveting guns filled the air day and night. Young women known as Rosie the Riveters became symbols of strength. Cafeterias served meals around the clock. Entire neighborhoods were built to house the workers, Kaiser towns, filled with families whose lives revolved around the tides of production. And yet, despite the chaos and fatigue, there was purpose. America was not merely replacing ships lost in battle, it was outbuilding the war itself. Every carrier launched was a statement to the world. You may sink one today, but another will take its place tomorrow. By the end of 1943, when the USS Bunker Hill and Yorktown II entered service, even the most optimistic German analysts began to revise their expectations. The United States had achieved what no empire before it ever had: the ability to replace destruction with creation, faster than war could consume it. And as the new carriers steamed westward across the Pacific, their decks filled with aircraft gleaming under tropical sun, a new kind of warfare was about to begin, one that would test not only machines, but the human will behind them. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, the Axis powers could feel it. By 1943, the phrase "arsenal of democracy" was no longer a slogan, it was a living organism. Every rivet, every spark, every shift change was part of a synchronized industrial heartbeat that spanned an entire continent. The United States had turned its factories into engines of total war. Assembly lines that once built Buicks and Fords were now producing ship turbines and aircraft engines. The nation's railways became arteries, pumping raw materials, steel from Pittsburgh, aluminum from Tennessee, and oil from Texas toward the shipyards on both coasts. No other country had ever attempted such a scale of production. America wasn't just making weapons, it was redefining the logistics of war. The scale was so vast that every hour, somewhere in the country, a new ship slid into the water. At the center of it all stood the Essex-class carriers, massive steel fortresses assembled in pieces across multiple states, then joined like clockwork under the eyes of naval engineers. By adopting modular construction, America transformed shipbuilding from craftsmanship into mass production. Where a German or British shipyard might take years to complete a single vessel, American yards were producing one carrier every few months. The process was as brutal as it was efficient. Work never stopped. Floodlights turned night into day. Welding arcs flickered like lightning across miles of steel. The noise was constant, hammering, cutting, shouting, a symphony of determination that no bomb or torpedo could silence. And behind it all was something the Axis never fully understood, a democracy that could outproduce dictatorships because it inspired belief, not obedience. The Essex-class was not the most advanced carrier ever designed, but it was the most buildable. American engineers had learned hard lessons from earlier classes like the Yorktown and Lexington. The new ships needed to be fast, durable, and easy to reproduce. The Navy's Bureau of Ships stripped away non-essential features, focusing on modularity and adaptability. Designs were standardized, blueprints were duplicated and distributed to every shipyard involved. Even the smallest details were rethought for speed. Hull plates were pre-cut off-site. Electrical systems were designed in plug-in units. Elevators, radar systems, and fire control towers were built as prefabricated modules that could be hoisted into place. This meant that a yard on the East Coast could be constructing the hangar deck, while another on the West Coast worked on the island superstructure, and both could be welded together in record time. Technological genius lay not in complexity, but in efficiency. American engineers realized that what mattered most was not building the best carrier, but building enough of them. The result was a ship that balanced speed and durability with production practicality. The Essex-class could carry more planes, endure more damage, and be repaired faster than anything the Axis possessed. It became a weapon of logistics as much as of war. German shipwrights, trained in meticulous craftsmanship, could not comprehend the American willingness to sacrifice elegance for volume. To them, industrial speed seemed reckless. To the Americans, it was survival. Every simplified bolt, every duplicated component was a victory against time. And time, as the war proved, was the most powerful weapon of all. Behind the welding masks and heavy cranes were faces, tired, young, determined. Men and women who'd never worn uniforms but fought their own battles in the shipyards. They worked in relentless shifts, 12, sometimes 16 hours a day. The clang of steel was their soundtrack. Cafeterias served midnight breakfasts for the night crews. Posters on the walls read, "The faster we build, the sooner they come home." These workers were the invisible soldiers of the war. They came from every background imaginable. Immigrants from Poland and Italy labored beside farmers from Kansas. Housewives from Oregon learned to rivet deck plates while their husbands fought on Pacific Islands. African-American workers, long denied industrial jobs, now filled the yards in growing numbers, their sweat fueling the same war machine that promised them equality someday. The conditions were brutal. Welding burns, crushed fingers, exhaustion. Yet absenteeism remained astonishingly low. There was pride in this labor, a shared understanding that every completed hull meant hundreds of sailors would have a fighting chance. A welder might never see the Pacific, but she would know that somewhere an aircraft was taking off from a deck she helped create. That connection between factory and frontline gave the war an emotional depth that statistics could never measure. It wasn't just ships being built in those yards, it was morale, it was belief. By 1943, when reporters visited Kaiser's yards, they found not despair, but rhythm, a national choreography of purpose. A journalist wrote, "There is no sound in the world quite like an American shipyard at midnight. It is the sound of a nation deciding not to lose." And as these workers hammered, riveted, and welded beneath the floodlights, far away across the oceans, German commanders continued to boast that America's factories could never match their torpedoes. They hadn't yet realized that the real war, the one that would decide everything, wasn't being fought on the seas. It was being fought in the smoke and steel of America's shipyards. The next wave of understanding would come from the other side of the front, from the admirals, intelligence officers, and leaders who began to sense that something extraordinary was happening behind America's industrial curtain. The leadership angle. Admiral King's relentless vision. If there was one man who embodied America's naval transformation, it was Admiral Ernest J. King, the iron-willed, cigar-chewing chief of naval operations. Known for his sharp temper and sharper clarity, King understood early what many in Washington did not. The war would be decided not by battleships, but by carriers. While others argued over resource allocations and defensive priorities, King demanded action. He famously declared, "Build carriers first, everything else will follow." To him, the carrier was not just a ship, it was a mobile airfield, a symbol of reach, speed, and adaptability. King's strategic insight changed the very DNA of American naval planning. Instead of focusing on preserving ships, he focused on replacing them. He pushed the Navy's Bureau of Ships and the Maritime Commission to accelerate production even when parts were scarce, even when blueprints weren't finalized. "Build now, fix later," he ordered, a phrase that horrified traditionalists but saved years. Under King's directive, the Navy abandoned perfection in favor of scale. He approved parallel construction, overlapping designs, and even authorized temporary shortcuts in peacetime standards to meet wartime needs. Behind the facade of calm Washington offices, King was fighting his own war, not against Germany or Japan, but against time itself. He knew the carriers being built in 1943 would decide the battles of 1944 and 1945. German and Japanese intelligence never understood the personality behind America's naval rise. They saw numbers, not leadership. But those numbers came from one man's relentless conviction that industrial courage could be as decisive as battlefield heroism. And King was right. Every Essex-class hull launched under his command became a moving fortress in the Pacific, each one proof that America's war machine had outpaced imagination itself. The enemy angle. Disbelief and denial. In Berlin and Tokyo, disbelief turned to confusion. The Kriegsmarine's Intelligence Bureau struggled to reconcile conflicting reports. In early 1943, German agents in Spain and Portugal reported sightings of multiple new American carriers in the Atlantic, far more than their analysts believed possible. The reports were dismissed as Allied propaganda. Admiral Donitz scoffed at the notion. He had reportedly said during a staff meeting, "They are building illusions. We will sink every one before it matters." But the numbers didn't lie. In less than 2 years, America had replaced not only every carrier lost in battle, but had launched a fleet that dwarfed every Axis navy combined. Captured German naval correspondents later revealed a chilling arrogance, a belief that technical superiority outweighed industrial capacity. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat crews prided themselves on craftsmanship and precision, while ridiculing what they called Yankee mass production. They could not grasp that in modern war, the speed of replacement mattered more than the quality of any single weapon. In Tokyo, the reaction was more cautious but no less troubled. Japanese naval intelligence reported that American shipyards are building carriers with astonishing rapidity, but their data was incomplete. By mid-1943, Japanese estimates still placed total U.S. fleet carriers at 8. The actual number was more than double. At Truk Lagoon, Admiral Mainichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor, received photographs of new American flat-tops moving through the Pacific. His staff dismissed them as recycled images of the same vessels. The scale of American production seemed impossible. But reality would soon reveal itself, not through intelligence reports, but through experience. As German U-boats prowled the Atlantic and Japanese pilots launched desperate counterattacks in the Pacific, both powers began to realize the same grim truth. America could lose ships faster than the Axis could build them and still grow stronger. It was a strategic nightmare, one born not from combat, but from disbelief. The moral angle. The spirit of industrial warfare. At the core of America's shipbuilding miracle was something deeper than machinery. It was belief. The Second World War wasn't just a conflict of armies, it was a moral contest between oppression and endurance. Every worker in a shipyard, every riveter, every engineer believed that their labor mattered. They weren't just building ships, they were building time, giving soldiers and sailors the chance to fight another day. Factories became temples of purpose. A sense of collective will permeated every shift. When a new carrier was launched, workers gathered along the dockyards to watch her slide into the water. Some cried, some saluted. They knew that within weeks, that ship would be halfway across the Pacific, carrying the hopes of a nation with it. For Germany, this was the most alien concept of all. Nazi propaganda exalted obedience and fear. American propaganda exalted unity and creation. The contrast was profound. One ideology demanded control. The other thrived on collaboration. In a democracy, workers weren't forced to build, they chose to. That choice gave them something stronger than any dictator's command: a reason. It was this moral foundation that turned steel and sweat into power. The German belief in destruction could not outlast the American belief in renewal. By the time German analysts began to recognize this truth, it was too late. America's industrial rhythm had become unstoppable, its morale unbreakable. Every new hull launched into the Atlantic or Pacific carried not just planes and pilots, but the quiet message of a nation that refused to yield. And soon, that message would roar to life in the most decisive way possible. Not in factories or blueprints, but on the open seas where the war's true turning point awaited. The tide of production had built its momentum. Now, it was time for that momentum to collide with the Axis navies in battle, where industrial leadership and willpower would converge into one explosive reckoning. By mid-1943, the rhythm of the war had changed. The echo of hammers in America's shipyards had transformed into the thunder of propellers over the Pacific. Where once Japan's carriers ruled the seas, now the horizon itself seemed filled with the flat silhouettes of U.S. Navy flat tops, Essex-class giants fresh from the docks, steaming toward destiny. The first true test of this industrial onslaught came with Operation Galvanic, the Battle of Tarawa, in November 1943. It was a small island, barely 3 miles long, yet it became a stage on which America's industrial power revealed its purpose. For the first time, the U.S. Navy deployed a carrier task force built almost entirely from ships launched after Pearl Harbor. 4 Essex-class carriers, USS Essex, USS Bunker Hill, USS Yorktown CV-10, and USS Lexington CV-16 led the assault. Each ship carried nearly 100 aircraft, more than Japan could field across entire fleets by that point. As dawn broke over Tarawa's coral reefs, American aircraft rose from the decks in perfect sequence, squadron after squadron, each guided by radios made in Chicago factories, each flying engines cast in Detroit steel. The carriers that launched them were less than 2 years old, the product of a nation that had refused to stop building even as it bled. The Japanese defenders fought fiercely, but Tarawa was more than a battle. It was a demonstration. American carriers struck from hundreds of miles away, sustained for days without pause, replenished by an endless stream of oilers, transports, and supply ships, all born from that same assembly line miracle back home. And yet, even as victory came at a brutal cost, the lessons were clear. The U.S. Navy had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, it had evolved into something the Axis had never prepared to face: a floating, self-replicating war machine. In Berlin, intercepted intelligence from the Pacific stunned analysts. Reports claimed that the U.S. Navy had launched more aircraft in a single operation than Germany's Luftwaffe could deploy across an entire theater. Admiral Donitz, reading the summaries, dismissed them as exaggerations, but his officers began to wonder. Then came 1944, the year America's shipyards reached full stride. Each month, new Essex-class carriers rolled off the docks: USS Wasp, Hornet, Ticonderoga, Bennington. They were followed by escort carriers, destroyers, and oilers, all built at a pace the world had never seen. When the Marianas Campaign began in June 1944, the United States deployed an armada of 15 carriers, 8 of them Essex-class. Facing them was a diminished Japanese fleet, desperate and underfueled. The skies above Saipan, Guam, and Tinian filled with American planes, Hellcats and Avengers swarming like locusts. Each carrier became a factory of death, launching sorties every few minutes, rearming and refueling without pause. Behind them, the logistics fleet, another triumph of industry, delivered ammunition, food, and fuel with precision that rivaled any land-based supply chain. On June 19, 1944, the world witnessed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the most one-sided air battle in history. Over 400 Japanese aircraft attacked the American task force, but the pilots they faced were well-trained, well-equipped, and backed by radar, coordination, and overwhelming numbers. By sunset, more than 350 Japanese planes had been destroyed, while American losses barely reached 30. The carriers had done their job, but what shocked observers most was what came next. Within days of the battle, the USS Lexington and the USS Enterprise returned to their replenishment points, refueled, and were back in action within a week. In the same time, Japanese yards couldn't even replace a single lost aircraft carrier. Germany's situation mirrored Japan's in a different theater. In the Atlantic, U-boats were dying faster than they could be built.
Factories bombed, steel supplies strangled, the Kriegsmarine was crumbling. By contrast, America's eastern seaboard shipyards were still launching vessels at full speed, unthreatened by invasion or bombardment. By late 1944, American carrier power had become almost surreal. New ships entered the Pacific faster than the enemy could count them. At Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, the U.S. Navy deployed over 30 carriers, each bristling with aircraft. From dawn until dusk, the sea and sky merged into a single storm of machinery and fire. Bombs fell, torpedoes streaked, and radar screens pulsed with hundreds of moving contacts. The Japanese Navy, once a proud force that had dictated the tempo of war, was annihilated in less than 72 hours. The industrial tide had become unstoppable. In Berlin, the mood turned grim. German intelligence officers began circulating a phrase whispered by their naval contacts. The Americans are building carriers faster than we can sink them. To some, it sounded like defeatism. To others, it was simply the truth. Because even as U-boats prowled and Luftwaffe bombers struck at Allied shipping, the numbers told an unforgiving story. America was producing one new aircraft carrier every 60 days, and there was nothing the right could do to slow it down. The war of machines was no longer a contest. It had become a landslide. And yet, the true turning point was still to come, when Germany and Japan would finally see the full scale of what America had built and understand that their navies were fighting not just a fleet, but an idea. An idea forged in steel, speed, and relentless willpower.
By early 1945, the war had entered its final thunderous act, and the full weight of American industry had finally revealed itself to the Axis powers. Every week, new carriers steamed out of the shipyards: USS Hancock, USS Randolph, USS Bonhomme Richard, and dozens more. The ocean itself seemed to tremble beneath their passage. Behind them trailed oilers, escort ships, and ammunition freighters in endless convoys, forming what journalists later called the conveyor belt of victory. To the Germans and Japanese alike, this was something incomprehensible. War not as a test of courage or tactics, but as an assembly line of annihilation. When American forces approached Iwo Jima in February 1945, the sight from the Japanese bunkers was apocalyptic. Over the horizon, 16 aircraft carriers stood in formation, their decks crawling with aircraft, while waves of battleships and destroyers stretched beyond the visible line of the sea. The bombardment began before dawn, a wall of fire and steel that shattered everything in its path. Thousands of shells and rockets turned the volcanic island into smoke and dust. Then, as the sky cleared, came the sound that every Japanese soldier had learned to fear: the rising hum of hundreds of F-6F Hellcats and TBM Avengers roaring in from the carriers. To those on the ground, it was as if the sky itself had turned American. The Japanese defenders fought to the last man, but the scale of what they faced was beyond imagination. American carriers operated like machines, launching, recovering, refueling, and launching again in perfect rhythm. Their pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day. Replacement aircraft were waiting below deck. Replacement pilots were being trained in Florida as they fought. Replacement carriers were already sliding down slipways back in Virginia and California. It was war as an infinite loop, destruction powered by production. And in that loop lay the death sentence for the Axis. Across the Pacific, Japanese Admiral Somio Toyoda received reports from surviving fleet commanders after the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. They told him what he already suspected: Japan had no more carriers, no more oil, no more hope. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was reduced to a few battered cruisers and destroyers. When Toyoda's staff presented updated intelligence on the American fleet, the numbers were staggering. The United States now had over 100 aircraft carriers, with another 50 still under construction. His officers were silent. No amount of training or bravery could balance that equation. Meanwhile, in Europe, Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German U-boat arm, faced his own nightmare. Once confident that his submarines could strangle Britain and starve the Allies into submission, he now watched as American Liberty ships, escort carriers, and destroyer escorts rolled out of shipyards faster than his losses could even be reported. German shipyards, bombed into rubble, couldn't replace even a fraction of what they lost. Factories in Hamburg, Bremen, and Kiel lay in ruins. Skilled workers had been drafted into the army or killed in air raids. Fuel supplies were dwindling. And yet, across the Atlantic, in Portland, Newport News, Brooklyn, and San Francisco, American yards glowed through the night, massive floodlights illuminating rows of cranes and scaffolds where new carriers took shape around the clock. For the Germans, this was not merely defeat, it was humiliation by mathematics. Each Essex-class carrier required 30,000 tons of steel and 2 million man-hours to complete. By 1944, American factories had optimized the process so efficiently that the average build time dropped to less than 18 months, while their smaller escort carriers were rolling out in under 120 days. At that speed, no strategy could compensate. Every ship sunk by the Axis was instantly replaced, often by 2 more. By April 1945, even as Berlin burned and Tokyo awaited its final reckoning, American shipyards were still building. Carriers like the USS Lake Champlain and USS Tarawa were launched into a war already won, a symbol of how far ahead the United States had moved.
The war was no longer a fight for survival, it was an industrial symphony, an unstoppable force that could have kept going for years more if needed. In the post-war months, as Allied intelligence scoured German archives, they found transcripts of intercepted American production reports. Some German analysts had tried to calculate the rate of carrier construction, but their numbers were so absurdly high that senior officers refused to believe them. One line, written in the margin of a naval report, summed up the disbelief perfectly. The Americans claimed to be launching a new carrier every 20 minutes. Surely this is propaganda. But it wasn't propaganda. While no shipyard literally launched one carrier every 20 minutes, the aggregate pace of American production, across hundreds of factories, shipyards, and subcontractors, effectively meant that every 20 minutes, another major combat vessel, landing ship, or escort unit entered service. To the defeated Axis, it didn't matter if it was technically true. It felt true. The waves of American ships, the endless convoys, the sky filled with aircraft, all of it gave the impression of a nation whose industry had no limit. And that impression is what broke them. In August 1945, as the mushroom clouds rose over Japan, the U.S. Navy's fleets remained at full strength. Dozens of carriers still on active duty, hundreds of ships in reserve, and thousands more under construction. The war was over, but the machine kept moving. For Germany and Japan, the lesson was burned into memory. Industrial capacity had become the ultimate weapon. They entered the war believing courage and strategy would decide victory. They left it understanding that mass production had rewritten the laws of warfare. And as peace returned to the oceans, the skeletal remains of Axis fleets lay beneath the waves, silent witnesses to a truth their admirals never believed. The Americans didn't just build faster, they built forever.
When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was no longer an ocean, it was an American highway. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, the water was lined with carriers, transports, oilers, and supply ships bearing the white stars of the United States Navy. The sheer scale of it was staggering. At the war's end, the U.S. Navy possessed over 6,700 vessels, including more than 100 aircraft carriers of all sizes, from towering Essex-class fleet carriers to the smaller, rapidly built escort types. No other nation in history had ever commanded such a floating armada. And the numbers told a story beyond victory, a story of transformation. Just 4 years earlier, in 1941, America had been caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, with only 7 operational carriers. Now, those same waters were crowded with ships so numerous that naval officers joked they could walk to Japan without getting their feet wet. But behind the pride lay exhaustion and reflection. The shipbuilders of Newport News, Brooklyn, and San Francisco had worked day and night for nearly half a decade. Men who had never left their hometowns had contributed just as much to the war as soldiers on the front. Women welders, known as Rosie the Riveters, had built hulls, fastened plates, and assembled engines with precision once thought impossible. In many shipyards, workers cheered when the final carrier of the war, the USS Philippine Sea, CV-47, slid into the water in September 1944, even before the war's end. But the celebrations were mixed with fatigue and disbelief that the massive machine they had built was finally slowing down. By 1946, that machine would begin to shut off, yard by yard. The Maritime Commission halted emergency shipbuilding contracts. Carriers that had launched in triumph months earlier were mothballed, anchored in quiet reserve fleets along the coasts. The USS Bunker Hill, battered by kamikazes, was sent home and never repaired. Others, like USS Franklin, too damaged to fight again, were quietly decommissioned. Yet even in storage, America's naval power dwarfed that of the rest of the world combined. Germany's Kriegsmarine lay in ruins, its few surviving U-boats surrendered and scuttled under Allied supervision. Where once the Axis had sought to dominate the seas, now only the United States remained, its shipyards intact, its industry stronger than ever. This industrial dominance had reshaped global strategy overnight. Europe, shattered and starving, looked to America not only for protection, but for reconstruction. Through the Marshall Plan and post-war aid, U.S. factories pivoted from war to peace, building tractors where they had once built tanks, merchant ships where they had built destroyers. But the carriers remained, silent giants moored in rows at Norfolk, Bremerton, and Alameda. Their gray hulls gleamed in the sun, a reminder that America could build them again if needed, and faster than anyone could ever hope to destroy them. Across the Atlantic, German engineers and economists studied captured documents with disbelief. In war's aftermath, they learned the hard truth. American shipyards had reached a level of industrial synchronization that was simply unimaginable under Nazi Germany's fragmented system. Where German shipyards worked in isolation, American ones worked as a network. Components were built in Pittsburgh and shipped to San Diego. Engines came from Detroit, radios from New Jersey. Everything fit together like clockwork, standardized, interchangeable, unstoppable. It wasn't just shipbuilding. It was a philosophy, one that fused democracy with machinery, freedom with production, and human will with industrial precision.
By 1947, America's naval fleet was being reduced, but its legacy was fixed. The Essex-class carriers, symbols of speed and strength, were now the blueprint for the Cold War Navy. Some would be refitted with jet decks, others converted into training or anti-submarine carriers. A few, like USS Yorktown and USS Intrepid, would survive long enough to become museums, silent memorials to the feverish years when the world was built in steel and sweat. And for the men who had doubted, the German officers who once scoffed at American mass production, history had delivered its verdict. The Americans had not only replaced every ship lost to German and Japanese attacks, they had replaced the idea that war was limited by time or material. For the first time in history, a nation had built faster than its enemies could destroy. And that changed everything. In the years that followed, the shadow of that wartime miracle stretched far beyond the ocean. America's ability to build aircraft carriers faster than its enemies could sink them became a defining symbol of 20th century power, not just military, but industrial, psychological, and ideological. Across Europe and Asia, historians and military planners pored over the lessons of U.S. shipbuilding. The consensus was clear: the United States had turned warfare into engineering. While Germany had relied on technological superiority, the precision of its optics, the complexity of its submarines, America had bet on quantity fused with reliability. The result wasn't elegant, but it was overwhelming. The Essex-class wasn't the most advanced design in the world, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that it could be built quickly, repaired easily, and replicated endlessly. That principle reshaped the post-war era. When the Cold War dawned, America's massive fleet of carriers became the ultimate currency of deterrence. Wherever a crisis erupted, Korea, Vietnam, the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, an American carrier group was already en route. Each of those ships traced its lineage back to the wartime production miracle of the 1940s, when factory towns had learned to treat war like an assembly line. By contrast, Germany's naval legacy disappeared almost entirely. The Kriegsmarine's surviving engineers were either captured or recruited by the Allies. Many were stunned by what they saw in American shipyards, not just machines, but organization, the invisible weapon that had defeated them. They discovered that the U.S. Navy's Wartime Logistics Command had overseen more than 60,000 suppliers, synchronized across all time zones, managed by data cards and tabulators that predated computers. It was the world's first glimpse of the kind of integrated production network that would later power NASA's Apollo program and the modern defense industry. Meanwhile, Japan, once a proud maritime empire, was forbidden from rebuilding its navy. Yet in the 1950s, under U.S. occupation, Japanese shipbuilders studied the same American efficiency that had destroyed them. The result was a rebirth. Within 2 decades, Japan became a global leader in commercial shipbuilding, a peaceful echo of the same principles that had fueled its defeat. Back home, the men and women who had worked in the yards tried to return to normal life, but the scale of what they had accomplished was hard to comprehend. They had outbuilt fascism itself. They had proven that a free, decentralized democracy could mobilize with a speed and intensity no dictatorship could match. For many, that was the true victory, not just in battle, but in belief. In the archives of the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships, one memo from 1944 captures that sentiment perfectly. It reads, "Our enemies thought production was a question of machinery. They never understood. It's a question of spirit." That spirit carried forward into every carrier launched after the war: Midway, Forrestal, Enterprise, and beyond. Each one bore the invisible fingerprints of the wartime workers who had once labored through the night under those blinding floodlights, turning steel and sweat into victory. Even decades later, when German veterans reflected on their defeat, they spoke less about tactics and more about tempo. One Kriegsmarine officer interviewed in 1953 said quietly, "We believed we were fighting men. They were building an ocean." And that ultimately became the legacy of America's wartime shipbuilding, not a single battle, but a transformation of how nations thought about power. In the industrial silence that followed 1945, the shipyards fell quiet, the cranes rusted, and the torches went cold. But the blueprint remained, a promise that if the world ever descended into chaos again, the same floodlights could ignite, the same sparks could fall, and the same unstoppable rhythm could return. Because history had proven a truth no enemy dared doubt again. You could sink an American ship, but you could never sink American industry. In the stillness after victory, the world took its first deep breath in years. The oceans that had once thundered with war were quiet now, their waves washing over the rusted remains of fleets that had once ruled them. Yet beneath that silence lay a revelation that would shape the modern age. The Second World War had begun as a contest of nations, but it ended as a contest of systems. Germany and Japan believed that speed, precision, and discipline would triumph. America proved that freedom, scale, and adaptability could build faster, fight longer, and endure more than any empire driven by fear. The aircraft carrier at Steel Island of Power became more than a weapon. It became the embodiment of America's new identity: mobile, industrial, limitless. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose a nation that learned not just to strike back, but to outproduce, outlast, and outthink its enemies. For the German officers who once laughed at the idea of America replacing her ships faster than they could sink them, the war's end brought silence and awe. What they had underestimated was not machinery, but momentum. The will of a people who believed that no setback was final, that every loss could be rebuilt, better and stronger. In the decades that followed, those carriers became the stage upon which global history played out. Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, each one a moving monument to the war that taught the world a new rule. In modern conflict, victory doesn't belong to the nation with the best weapon, but to the one that can build it again, tomorrow. As the last of the Essex-class carriers retired into museums, the weld marks still visible on their decks stood quiet signatures of a generation that built not for glory, but for endurance. Because in the end, World War II revealed a truth that transcended the battlefield, that wars are won not by those who destroy the fastest, but by those who create the fastest. And somewhere in that relentless rhythm of construction, between hammer and flame, America found the secret to its power, the ability to rise again every time the world tried to sink it.